Hey there, this is Kilby Blade speaking. I'm the Interim Executive Director of National Novel Writing Month, here to share the state of the organization. I apologize for the time it's taken to pull this together, though as you'll see, there is a lot of information here. It's essentially impossible to understand where NaNoWriMo is right now without giving some context, and talking about things that the organization historically chose not to discuss. Over the years, most of the communications that were sent out focused on the spirit of the event and didn't talk much about what it took to run the organization. Bear with me as I try to explain not just what the state of NaNoWriMo is, but also why. Before we dive into some financial context, I'll mention that I've been the Interim Executive Director since December of 2023. Before that, I was a board member. I originally joined the board in the spring of 2022. NaNoWriMo itself started informally 25 years ago in 1999. It became a nonprofit in 2006 and grew into a global phenomenon with tens of thousands of official participants each season. Our mailing list alone has more than 500,000 subscribers and very high engagement rates. By any standard, this is a community with tremendous worldwide reach. When people come across communities as large and as old as ours, they assume that we must be well funded. Even when I joined the board in 2022, I figured we must be getting 5- and 6-figure support from big publishers, big authors, and other big fans of what we do. But NaNoWriMo never had that level of financial backing, and with a budget of only about $1.3 million a year, we are on the smaller side for a nonprofit. As you can see from these numbers, NaNoWriMo operated at a budget deficit for 4 of the past 6 years, which means it wasn't netting enough in donations and other income to support itself. During those years, cash reserves were drawn from to make up for budget shortfalls. And when cash reserves jumped up again in 2020, that was due to a $150,000 COVID relief loan that was taken out by previous leadership. Without that loan, the organization would have operated at a deficit for 5 out of the past 6 years, rather than 4. Most nonprofits that are struggling to this degree and that experience prolonged difficulties go to their communities with candor about the seriousness of their situation. But if you look back at the fundraising messages that went out to our community over this period, there was very little signaling that the organization was in distress. Another indicator of an organization's financial health is its funding sources. Most nonprofits are primarily funded by donations, but for years NaNoWriMo has received the majority of its revenue from merchandise and sponsorships, more than 50%. The community size really matters here because, again, if you have hundreds of thousands of people engaging with us every year, which is a truly massive number for any community, but the organization itself is bringing in just over $1 million, that's a pretty big sign of distress. And if you look at the trend over time, the organization was becoming more dependent on funding sources other than donations. Individual giving fell in recent years, and merchandise sales and sponsorships were boosted to compensate for that. The final piece of the financial picture is how little of the organization's funding was going to program expenses and technology. The organization only spent 8.7% of its total budget on both. For anybody who does NaNoWriMo every year, you know that we have our share of technical problems and that our website looks and functions like it was built years ago, which it was. Our last major technology upgrade was 7 years ago, in 2018. Chronic underinvestment in both our NaNoWriMo and our Young Writers Program websites have made both sites hard to maintain and near their breaking points. So to recap, the organization was operating at a deficit for many years. It was primarily funded by sponsorships and merchandise and not by charitable contributions. And it didn't have the sustainability mechanisms you would hope to see, like an endowment, a critical mass of major donors, or a reliable set of foundation grants. As early as 2020, NaNoWriMo was taking on 6-figure debt to fund its operating expenses, debt which it still holds. By the time I arrived as interim executive director in December of 2023, only a very small portion of that COVID loan had been repaid over the course of 3.5 years, and the organization had accumulated additional debt. So what was being done about all of this? During my time on the board, we were focused on what we should have been focused on, which was fundraising. In early 2022, the board approved a new full-time position for a director of community fundraising that was 100% dedicated to bringing in new donations. The board was actively working on an online auction that was supposed to launch in November of 2023. We were strategizing festivities for NaNoWriMo's 25th anniversary and were hoping to do literary salons as well as a mega fundraiser in 2024 for our anniversary. Also, the board was extremely small in 2022 and 2023, so we were focused on board recruitment. Then, serious complaints were brought directly to the board in November of 2023 during National Novel Writing Month. Several members of the community reported that specific staff members had mishandled a child endangerment complaint. The accusers had told staff back in May of 2023 that a moderator was grooming children on a different website, as in not on NaNoWriMo. Based on their own speculation, they asked for the moderator to be removed from our site. The staff in question eventually removed the moderator, but for unrelated code of conduct violations, and not until many weeks after the initial complaints. The board investigated the matter and concluded that the staff should have acted differently, not only in its response to the complaint, but also in its failure to disclose such a serious matter to the board. After the initial accusations of child endangerment due to mismanagement of our volunteer moderators were waged, members of the community stepped forward with more concerns. For example, the board was shown how, on our Young Writers Program website, anybody could create an educator account and invite students to their classroom. Others approached the board, saying they had raised previous child endangerment concerns to staff that they felt had gone unaddressed. So, what did we discover about NaNoWriMo's child safety practices in November of 2023 while I was still a member of the board? We discovered that staff had never been subjected to criminal background checks, despite NaNoWriMo being a youth-facing organization. We discovered that even though we had an all-ages policy on our main NaNoWriMo site and a dedicated Young Writers program with its own website, none of our staff or our 800 volunteers had completed state-mandated child safety training. We discovered that staff had not subjected volunteers to formal applications that required them to give us their legal name, address, phone numbers, or any verified identifying information. That's important because when the board got involved with accusations made against the moderator and contacted the FBI's National Center for Missing or Exploited Children in order to understand what we should do in this situation, we were asked who this volunteer was, but we literally could not tell the authorities the legal identity of this person. The organization didn't keep those kinds of records. So based on all of this, it was clear that there was work that had to start immediately and that there had to be a leadership change. By December of 2023, less than a month after the complaints were brought to light, I voluntarily resigned from the board and came in on a 6-month contract basis to be the interim executive director. The idea was to bring in someone who understood youth-facing organizations, who had experience with the required state-mandated training. My other talents were also desirable. Given the organization's financial problems, formal business and fundraising experience was a major reason why I had been recruited to the board. Our top priority is, and was, child safety. That meant that, in addition to keeping the organization and all of its services going, we had to commit to several new projects. And we did some amazing work. First and foremost, we implemented staff background checks. That started immediately in December of 2023. In 2024, we ended our policy of all ages spaces, and we did the back-end technical work to make it so that there was one set of permissions and discoverability if you were an adult, and a completely different set if you were a minor. We shut down features that were potentially dangerous to minors, mainly in relation to how minors were able to craft their bios and whether they were able to reveal their locations. We developed advice content to help minors understand how to protect their safety online. On the Young Writers Program, we started verifying that people who said they were educators were actually educators, and we developed materials and guidelines for teachers around safety. We laid the groundwork for a legally compliant volunteer program that included all of the necessary child safety training. Our second priority is what I'll call truth and moderation. Remember, the second complaint that the board received was about staff moderation practices. Our official spaces, including our forums, were being moderated inconsistently, not only by staff, but also by volunteers. Our codes of conduct were outdated and insufficient and weren't being followed widely enough. Even though most people were participating with common sense civility, and even though great discussions were happening in some spaces, some of the behavior we saw was not only problematic, but unaddressable, given how it was being managed at that time. So part of the decision to pause the forums was about needing to regroup in the name of child safety. But it was also us knowing that not enough had been done to maintain the integrity of the space itself. And to be clear, this is a common problem that a lot of organizations have. In fact, if you look at other large community-driven forums that have been around as long as ours have, like Wattpad or IMDb or PlayStation, most of them shut down years ago because they're expensive to maintain and hard to moderate. Our final problem with moderation was that we had encouraged a practice of RIMOs who were not employees of the organization to set up Discord servers, Facebook groups, and other offshoots with the NaNoWriMo name, mainly because our own website didn't have the kinds of social features that other apps offered and that our community wanted. The problem was, nobody under NaNoWriMo's authority was actually moderating those groups. In addition to the legal implications that created for the organization, NaNoWriMo was using its resources to deal with help desk complaints about incidents that were happening in these outside groups. All of this led to some bigger internal conversations about our mission and the consequences of trying to be everything to everyone, and how instead of being intentional about ways that we could serve our mission excellently through 2 or 3 core program features, we were trying to operate with dozens of program features and doing all of them badly without a clear strategic plan in place. Needless to say, all of this was met with mixed reactions. Some of our community has been participating in NaNoWriMo for 10 or even 20 years, and the number of people who view themselves as experts by virtue of how long they've been doing NaNoWriMo or how long they've been volunteering numbers in the tens of thousands. There was definitely a sense of, just listen to us, we know what we're talking about, among people who were frustrated with the decisions that were being made at headquarters. But there was also a sense of relief among a different set of long-timers who felt that problems had been brewing for years and wanted to see them addressed. A third group of people had heard about the child endangerment accusations and were shocked and disappointed and wanted us to focus on that. One big criticism that some people had of the organization was that we were slow to make simple changes and that we weren't delivering fast enough on promises we'd made in 2023. What people probably didn't know is that by January and February, a host of other issues came to light. In total, there were more than a dozen existing labor violations when I came on board. They were serious enough to warrant being dealt with immediately. Some of them, if further ignored, could have placed our nonprofit status at risk. The other thing I discovered was a level of financial crisis and disarray that hadn't been apparent to me as a board member. The board sees very high-level financial statements, but digging even 1 or 2 layers deeper exposed some serious problems. There was other information that I learned once I came inside that I hadn't been privy to as a board member. During my time on the board, the declining numbers in our participation were described to me as deflation from the COVID bubble. I had never been shown numbers prior to 2020 or seen the longer range, but when I came on as interim ED and looked farther back at our numbers, I saw a very different trend and started to develop a very different understanding of what was really happening within the org. Participation had been declining for much, much longer than I knew, and this new information warranted board discussion. It soon became very clear that the interim ED job was bigger than rebuilding after a reputational crisis. NaNoWriMo had a litany of other problems that had been neglected. It was much bigger than a crisis of confidence and the list of operational fixes the board had committed to. So much more had to be addressed, and a lot needed to happen in order to pull all of the necessary changes off. So what actually happened in terms of our ability to restore the organization financially, reputationally, and programmatically? Financially, we took immediate hits. The child endangerment complaints had come forth in November 2023, the time of year when we do the most fundraising, and the organization was already not slated to meet its annual fundraising projections at that time. When all was said and done, 2023 brought in about $245,000 less than what was projected, nearly 20% of the organization's annual budget. By March of 2024, sponsorships had dropped by $185,000. By the second quarter, most of our previous foundation donors abandoned the organization. At this point, the financial cost of our 2023 reputational damage was starting to become clear. We put some irons in the fire on the fundraising front, and we're going after some grants and some major gifts. At one point, we were in serious talks about merging with a different writing organization, and we were working diligently to solve the organization's compliance and program problems in the hopes that we would earn back our community's support. And the crisis of confidence was the hardest part. The big sudden changes felt traumatic to a lot of people, and we understood why people were upset, because there hadn't been very many boundaries before. In a lot of ways, it had been a total free-for-all. But the stark reality was that we were operating outside of our mission in ways that were causing explicit problems. A lot of things that some people thought we should be, from an industry water cooler willing to host discussions on any topic, to an advocacy group that actively lobbied for authors, had nothing to do with completing a 50,000-word writing challenge or helping people cultivate personal creativity and meet individual writing goals. The final thing that actually happened in 2024 is that people did show up to do NaNoWriMo. Though our number of official participants continued on its multi-year downward trend, we still had a lot of engagement. Our email list size stayed the same, so did our email opens. Our click engagement actually went way up, and a lot of people still donated to the org. So the question we've had to ask ourselves as an organization is, has our progress been enough? Can NaNoWriMo be financially viable from a fundraising perspective? Can it maintain programs that meet the new standards we've had to build? Does it have enough community interest and community engagement to justify its existence long term? Does it have the capacity to overcome its history? The long-term answer to all of these things is undeniably yes. Unfortunately, we just don't have the financial runway to build the ecosystem NaNoWriMo needs. The problems at this moment are just too long-standing and too big. The organization has held six-figure debt since 2020. We saw $360,000 of our projected income, around 30% of our annual budget, disappear in the direct aftermath of November of 2023. And our best efforts to bring in new funding sources in 2024 could not compensate for those losses. So what's next for NaNoWriMo, the official nonprofit? After 6 years of severe financial problems and an unexpected crisis coming in at the very moment when we needed to have an extraordinary year, NaNoWriMo.org has no choice but to shut down. I'll tell you why there are no good alternatives in a minute. We will keep our websites up for as long as possible so that people can take what they want from their accounts, but we're not guaranteeing a specific end date. They'll stay up for as long as we can afford to keep them there. We also can't commit to moderating any of our spaces or to providing technical support. The organization is running completely on the efforts of the volunteers who we did vet this year. And this is where I should tell you that I have been unpaid since the end of May, and that has to be mentioned as well. Quite a number of people who have worked on NaNoWriMo in recent months have, like me, been completely unpaid and have put in significant time in the name of saving the organization. We wish that we could provide more support, but in addition to our team being exhausted after an extremely trying year, we're simply not in that position. And a fair bit of effort at this point will go to the responsible dismantling of the organization. Again, shutting down clearly wasn't a first choice. We did a lot this year to look for creative alternatives and to make some big asks that we hoped would allow the organization to pull through. I mentioned earlier that we were in talks about merging with another major writing organization, and those talks deteriorated once they found out about NaNoWriMo's debt. NaNoWriMo is not an attractive merger prospect right now. We also talked to other potential supporters who wanted to see the organization survive, but some of those allies were pretty taken aback by the community dynamic they were seeing on places like Reddit. A lot of people who had a view of the NaNoWriMo community as a welcoming community had that view challenged this year. And it wasn't because of what HQ was doing, but because of what they were seeing from people who were self-identified Rhymos. Numerous people who either withheld their support or supported us anonymously told us that the tone of the community itself was a big issue. Another thing that happened this year is that after we were covered so widely in the press, and frankly so inaccurately, about our position on artificial intelligence, a number of AI companies approached us with an interest in sponsorship. It's fair to say that we saw enough interest from AI companies that accepting their sponsorship would have bought the organization some time. But despite what people might think about our position on AI, we concluded that most of the new players that approached us would not be fitting sponsors because what their apps did went against our mission. But the real alternative to the organization closing, and I can't say this enough, would have been for us to have been funded by the community. We have a large enough community that funding a $1.3 million budget should never have been a problem. We were hoping that if we spoke more candidly about the organization's challenges, and that if we were simply open about our funding struggles, that it would yield a different result. But this was an objectively bad year to ask anybody in our community for money, and making over an inordinately weak funding program can't be achieved overnight. So I know what some of you are thinking. Could NaNoWriMo simply become more grassroots? I'm here to tell you it doesn't get more grassroots than the organization previously was. NaNoWriMo was a 12-person organization that had 800 volunteers doing the majority of the labor of the organization. It essentially was volunteer-run, and no matter how many volunteers are helping you, organizations still need cash. But the question of what's next for the organization as a legal nonprofit entity is very different from the question of what's next for actual RIMOs. And I'll stop to acknowledge that Nano's closure will cause no small amount of grief. I haven't used that word very much as part of this presentation, but I've used it a lot on other forums this year. Come November, NaNoWriMo as you have known it will no longer exist. And whether you love or hate NaNoWriMo at this moment, that's going to come with feelings. But just because this is the end of NaNoWriMo, the indebted nonprofit, we hold no belief that people will stop writing 50,000 words in November and seeking support for the journey they're on. In so many ways, it's a lot easier than it was when NaNoWriMo became a nonprofit in 2006 to find your writing tribe online. In fact, so many people were angry with NaNoWriMo this year that a ton of alternatives popped up. People did find each other, and they wrote in community without the help of the nonprofit. In 2024, many dissatisfied community members used NaNoWriMo.org to form separate communities, and we absolutely did not shut that down. To stop writers from finding community with other writers, regardless of their reasons, is antithetical to our mission. NaNoWriMo backlash in 2024 showed us firsthand how superfluous the organization itself might be, no matter how many of us, including me, wish it could still exist. I'll say a few things that we really want organizers of future endeavors to know, and I'm saying this with absolute certainty that 5 minutes after this video is published, some people will blame the AI backlash we saw in September for NaNoWriMo's demise. To blame NaNoWriMo's demise on the events of the past year does a disservice to all struggling nonprofits. What hurt the organization far more and for far longer than any of those things was the fact that too many members of a very large, very engaged community let themselves believe the service we provided was free. Though we had tens of thousands of generous donors who carried the organizations over the years, and so many volunteers who funded perks out of their own pockets, people to whom all of us owe a debt of gratitude, the vast majority of this tremendous community simply didn't give. Believe me, I know that not everybody can give, and that many people stretched to give what they could. My statements now are not an indictment of a community that I feel should have done more. They are a plea for you to look at the free services you use through a different lens. Public radio is struggling. Even Sesame Workshop, which produces Sesame Street, is on the brink, and arts nonprofits are faring the worst right now. Citizens who use those services have an important role to play. And the final factor leading to NaNoWriMo's closure was NaNoWriMo itself. A 6-year downward trend in participation was a big red flag. More should have been done to earn back the loyalty of this community and to tangibly improve our program offering. Over the years, opportunities were missed. But that's not the note that I want to end on, because even more than I believe that this community is owed an explanation, I believe in the hundreds of thousands of you who are owed a thanks. For 25 years, you came together and did some truly extraordinary things, things that should not be obscured. I want to say thank you to the thousands of municipal liaisons, moderators, and other volunteers who held community for writers looking for a space, and who truly went above and beyond. These are people who were spending significant time every single day helping other writers, often while they were doing NaNoWriMo themselves. A lot of these folks spent money out of their own pockets to create amazing local events. Some of them even did grassroots fundraising on behalf of the organization. These are people who, in a lot of cases, served as the face of the organization and were an indispensable part of making this community what it is. Thanks to the educators who brought NaNoWriMo to their classrooms and got young people to write. One of the most rewarding parts of my job during a pretty difficult year was hearing from educators who shared the impact that participating in NaNoWriMo had on their students. I also want to thank educators for totally and completely getting behind the organization in terms of improvements to its child safety practices. I want to thank the staff who truly cared about the organization and about the community and who worked every single day to make NaNoWriMo a fun place. And I want to honor the legacy of the people who really cared about carrying on the spirit of NaNoWriMo. I want to thank the many established authors and industry players who showed up every season to serve as pep talkers and camp counselors as well. I know something that early career writers struggle with is feeling legitimate, and I'm thankful for all of the contributions of people who gave early career writers the courage to step forward and write. This year I've had a chance to get to know a lot of our sponsors, and I can tell you that the ones I work closely with really care a lot about writers. Many of them are storytellers themselves, and most of them were tremendous, and I mean years-long supporters of NaNoWriMo. To our extremely generous donors, and to be clear, I mean donors that gave at every level because any amount of money can be a stretch, I want to thank you for showing up for NaNoWriMo month after month, year after year, in the name of helping yourself and other Rhymos receive access to our platform and services. To participants who helped other participants informally, even if you didn't have an official role as a volunteer, thank you for sharing your encouragement and your advice. It was through small acts of kindness from writer to writer that the heart of this community showed itself every day. To Chris Beatty for cooking up this wild and wonderful idea that inspired so many people, I thank you. And to anybody and everybody who showed up for writing and was inspired by NaNoWriMo, honor yourself for all you've done, and don't forget to keep writing.